Hi everybody, I wanted to make a video showing how you can use some needle felting techniques to help finish your work and or solve some disasters. So first of all, if you've never done needle felting or used needle felting, this right here is a felting needle, and what it has is it has little barbs on the end of it, and it is used for tangling up fibers until they become cloth or felt. So that can actually be very useful with our yarn projects with crochet, doing some finishing, especially if you have little ends like this that pop up after you've tied in properly woven in your ends, and or you have disasters. So I'm going to go through and show you how you can use a felting needle to fix some pretty common problems. So always on the back of your work, what you're going to do is, here I have a proper knot and I've got nice long ends, so I'm going to show you how to properly weave in your ends. I always go one strand in a different direction than another, that way I don't get a big bulky spot. But you find a place on the back of your work where you can go through. The bottom ends of double crochets, or the bottom ends of any stitch, is one of my favorite places to do it. And you go through about an inch. You skip over one loop so that you catch the end, and then you come back. And then you skip over one loop and go through a third time. That should make a nice secure spot that will never ever ever unravel. And then you cut off the end right there. And then you go the other direction, you do it the other way. So if you're on a corner or something, you can find different paths to go through, but I usually try and find a good spot for the yarn. Sometimes in a circle, it's like around the center of this magic circle or something like that. But you try and find a place where it's not going to be too noticeable and it's not going to be too hard to get your yarn through. But you try and go about an inch or so one way. Skip one thread so that it catches and you don't just pull the yarn straight back through the way you came. And then you go a third time. Skip this. I apologize, I am not a YouTuber or anything like that, so my setup is not very sophisticated here. And so if I'm out of focus or something, or not within camera range, I apologize. Okay, so you pull that through and stretch it out so we don't warp our fabric. And then you cut it off. So one of the really common complaints I've seen in the crochet forum is, what do I do about this little fuzzy end now that is poked out here? So this is where our needle felting will come in handy. So if you have a felting needle, you also need a foam pad or something that the needle can go into. Felting needles are extremely sharp, and those barbs go down pretty much to the point. So the first tip when doing this is, don't poke all the way through your work, because felting needles make things fuzzy and you'll end up with a fuzzy spot on your work. I will do that deliberately in a little bit so you can see. But what I try to do is find my fuzzy little end. You want to make sure it's going over, like this is all one color, but if you have different colors, you want to make sure it is going into a stitch of the same color, and just very, very lightly and gently poke it with your needle. So you're not going all the way through the yarn, but you're going about halfway through the yarn of the stitch of the yarn below. And if you keep poking it, it's going to tangle up with that yarn and become essentially one thread of yarn, or sometimes a little like patch. But you keep poking it until it disappears and you can't see it anymore. just like that. So now I no longer have a fuzzy little bit hanging out here. Well, got a little bit more to do there. That looks better. Okay. So yeah, now there's no more fuzzy little tail hanging out. It looks nice and neat. You always check your other side. So checking the front work, it looks perfect. No fuzzy spots. So I have another little tail here from where I actually wove in the end of this swatch. So I'm going to go ahead and do that one real quick. Again, very light pokes, trying not to go all the way through your yarn. Try and find kind of like a thick spot, you know, like a bottom of a stitch or a place where the yarn is twisted over itself in a nice kind of thick way. Sometimes, very carefully, if you want, you can kind of go sideways like this, but be very, very careful because these needles are really like crazy sharp and you do not want to poke yourself with them. They also break very easily. So if you are going to get a yarn needle, I got this one out of like a little needle felting kit where I like made a little penguin. I think I got the kit at Michael's. So you can probably find a small needle felting kit. I use a medium felting needle. Some of them are fine and some of them are coarse. But medium seems to be really good for doing finishing work like this. So that second little tail is now no longer. I no longer have a fuzzy thing sticking out there. So I think I've got one more where, yeah, right here. So I've got one right here, little guy. So I'm gonna poke him in to one of these stitches real quick. This needle that I got out of just a basic kit is probably the best needle I have. It seems to be sturdier than others. So I actually use it for a lot of my needle felting projects, which is a super fun hobby, by the way. If you have lost your Crochet for some reason, you may want to pick up needle felting and do that for a little bit, get that creative outlet going. Okay, so here I've done this properly, just lightly. I made it disappear, and on the front side, you can see it still looks nice and neat, these stitches. But here's what happens if you do it too much and you poke all the way. So if you start going like, yay, I'm just gonna, you know, poke all the way through, what happens is you get a spot where you get fuzzies on the other side, and that's, you know, not the neatest look. So if you accidentally do that, sometimes you can smooth them out. Other times you can go, oops, I did it a little too much. And you can take your felting needle and just very, very lightly kind of poke some of those fuzzies back in again so that the front looks neat again. So light, gentle touch, try not to go all the way through the yarn, has been the best technique I have found for doing this. So now let's talk about some problems that you might have. So our first problem is, let's say you did not initially learn how to tie in your ends correctly, and you have a knot and it has been cut off close to the ends. Or, you know, you have a project where someone else did that and now you want to fix it. So the problem here is if too much pull and stress on that knot happens, or the knot loosens over time, the knot can come undone, and then we have a true disaster. So we're trying to prevent this knot from coming undone. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little piece of extra yarn. We're going to make a bridge through this stitch around this knot, and we're going to felt this knot kind of into that extra yarn, and then felt the knot itself so that the knot stays tangled and hopefully doesn't come out. And if we do it right, we should end up with a nice, neat little knot that's been reinforced and hopefully will not come out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of yarn. I've got my yarn needle. And I'm going to just, with this yarn, kind of surround this knot with a few stitches with my yarn needle, basically whip stitches, just around where the knot is. It'll give us some extra material to felt into, and we can reinforce this knot. So just 2-3 stitches. If this is an old project and you don't have the same yarn, you can use a similar color yarn. Remember that this is the back of your work. So I'm not actually going to knot this because we're going to felt it all together. So I'm just going to cut it off. So I have 2 more kind of short little ends there. And now our goal is to felt this all together into one nice strong little piece of something. So I'm going to fold my work so that the knot and the strand that the knot was on is now away from the front of the work. So the front of the stitch is right here. And this is that back strand that I've now sewn some extra material onto. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this back strand, I am going to poke all the way through now because we're trying to make this one nice and sturdy now. So I'm going to poke through this, trying to get it kind of all together into one bunch. So now I have strands going from one side of the knot to the other side. Okay, now I'm going to flip it over. You see it's all fuzzy on this side now, and that's okay because I'm going to do it on the other, poke it back the other way. Again, this is folded in half, so hopefully we're not touching the front of our work at all. We're just kind of messing with one strand on the back. All right, so now for the knot itself, I'm going to hold it down, and with my yarn needle, I want to poke through that knot itself. I'm trying to get the knot to be extra tangly with itself so that hopefully that reinforces it a little bit and it doesn't come back out. All right. Sorry. So I'm going to keep at this for a little bit. Just basically trying to get all these fibers to come together into one secure thing. Okay. So now it's a little bigger than it was, and I still have the fuzzy stuff on top. So I'm going to fold this over and lay it down, and now we're going to do the technique like we did before, where I'm just very lightly going to try to not go through the top, but I'm going to kind of press it into the yarn that's just below it. So I've got the knot there, I've got the ends of the knot, and this looks kind of like a good spot to kind of try and attach it to the stitch below. So I'm going to get those fuzzies and just very lightly, not going all the way through the yarn, try to connect the fuzzies to the place below it. Until they're secure and they won't come out again. So there's our knot. Here are the fuzzies. Here's the extra yarn we used to make it kind of all one yarny mass here. Now, if we did this right, the stitch should look relatively normal on the front, but our knot should be pretty secure now. A lot more secure than it was anyway. It's going to be a lot harder for this knot to work its way out with all these fibers all tangled up all around it, and then its ends tangled up into other yarn as well. It takes quite a bit of force to get that to come undone now. So our front side, it's a little bit thicker there, but we still have what looks like a relatively normal stitch. No one's going to notice that in your work. And hopefully that knot will now never come out. Okay, so that's that repair. If you have long enough tails, and if the knots are loose enough, you can try just felting the knot. But if you're worried, you can create that little bridge with a little bit more yarn and just try and keep it all together. But that should reinforce the knot nicely for you. The more you felt something, the smaller it gets. So if you're worried about this stitch looking big or looking weird, you can keep felting it until it gets smaller. Just try and avoid fuzzy spots on the front. Although as blankets age, they tend to get fuzzy, so that becomes less noticeable still. Oops. We like to have nice finished work, finished looking work. Okay. So I am pretty happy with how that looks now. Looks like a fairly normal stitch there, where our knot was. A little bit fat, but that's okay. And that's how weaving in ends goes. All right, so there you have it. That would be, oops, I didn't actually weave in my ends properly. So yeah, you got a little bit of this mass on the back end, but that's better than the knot looked. And it should never come out now. And the more it washes, the more it's going to tangle up with itself and hopefully never come out. So the next problem is if you have cats like I do, kitty claw snag marks where yeah, a cat has decided to make some biscuits on your work, and that's never good. So I try and twist this up and just bring it down onto another thread. And again, very lightly, I'm trying not to go through to the front. We're just trying to make this come together into one thread of yarn again. So just poke it a little bit. If the snag is in the front, you can use a yarn needle to pull the snag through to the back, and then use your felting needle here to kind of tuck it in, and then you won't see it anymore. Like so. This is a great way to freshen up old blankets that have been clawed up by pets and things. So again, that's now disappeared. You want to kind of rub it a little bit, just make sure nothing else is coming out or sticking out. There we go. And your front should once again look nice and neat. So that one got stretched a little bit from the claw marks, but for the most part, we've got a nice neat row of stitches. And the final problem, this is the ultimate oh no disaster. You actually have a thread that's been severed or a knot that's come undone. So the first thing you need to do is assess if you actually have anything unraveling. So this has come undone enough that no new parts are coming unraveled. So I actually would tie this into a little knot. The ends that I have here, tie it into a little square knot if you can. Sometimes having a yarn needle can help with that effort. And this time I'll show you what it looks like kind of if you're worried about having too much bulk on the back of your blanket, you can kind of fix this. So we have the ends that came undone kind of loosely knotted together right here. And now I'm going to felt these guys together so that our work can't unravel here. So I've got it together. I've folded it apart so that I can felt it here and go all the way through it and not have to worry. We're going to make one little mass here. So if you want less bulk, I think this is probably just as secure as adding a little more yarn or a bridge to something. Theoretically, it works because right now we're making something that is really, really hard to pull apart. Like it's very hard to pull that apart, but it's a little messy looking. So once you have it kind of securely back together, do it the other way from the other side. All right. So now our ends that were unraveling are back together, and this piece is back together. We may have lost a piece of the stitch, and that's okay, but we're going to find kind of the weak spot in our pattern. This looks like the weaker stitch. This is the part that came unraveled a little bit, so that's the one we're going to needle felt to. So we're going to put it over that stitch, and we're going to felt it to that stitch. And I am poking all the way through because I really want this to stick together well. In this case, you know, a fuzzy spot in the blanket is better than a hole. So we're gonna tangle it up really good together right here. And then look on the front. Okay, it's a little bit fuzzy, so I can clean that up just a little bit. There. So now, stretching this out, I am not unraveling. It is secure, and that is not gonna come apart anytime soon. So if you don't want the bulk there, you don't necessarily need a bridge, but you do need to felt it pretty well, and you need to have enough length on the ends that those fibers can really wrap up and tangle up together. And that's all there is to it. This is fixing your work through needle felting. So you can see this one knot here, but that's not bad for back of work. You can see where this hole was. There's a little fuzzy spot back here, but that's not bad. Our tails themselves are completely invisible and not poking out. But the front of our work, for the most part, looks really, really good. So that's it. That's all there is to it. I hope this helps.